Just want to say welcome again and thank you for joining us for tonight's program. A key component of the Hauenstein Center's programming is the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. Every year, a cohort of student leaders join us for a unique leadership experience. At each of our events, we invite one of the fellow candidates to present a leadership minute, a brief reflection on their personal leadership journey. It is my privilege to introduce to you CLA fellow candidate Miranda Rudnick to share her leadership minute and introduce our moderator for this evening. Miranda is a first-generation college student and is in her third year of the Doctor of Physical Therapy program at GVSU. Miranda prides herself in diversifying her life experiences through travel. She has had the opportunity to travel to Alaska for a clinical experience and has participated in a medical mission trip to Guatemala. Since visiting Guatemala, Miranda has found a passion for clean water projects going on around the world, as water is an essential component to human life. Miranda hopes that she can one day work to implement solutions in countries or underserved areas with contaminated or unsafe drinking water while still participating in her day job, which sounds like a lot, but I believe you can do it. Additionally, Miranda enjoys photography, being active, and hiking. She is appreciative of her time that she has been able to spend with the CLA and is looking forward to her graduation this spring, as well as taking her boards exam this summer to become a licensed physical therapist. Please join me in welcoming Miranda.
My name is Miranda Rudnick, and I am a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate and a student in the Doctor of Physical Therapy program here at GVSU. I began my journey in the Cook Leadership Academy to, as we say in physical therapy, add more tools to my toolbox to help me become a change agent in healthcare and to better serve and advocate for my future patients and families. Patriotism is the topic of this evening. Patriotism is defined by Cambridge Dictionary as the feeling of loving your country more than any others and being proud of it. As I spent time reflecting on what I wanted to touch on during this brief speech, I noted that patriotism does have a place in healthcare, and it indeed does apply to my role as a future physical therapist, although seemingly unrelated. As I dug deeper, I found an interesting article written by Rosé et al. Titled The Role of Organizational Citizenship Behavior and Patriotism in Sustaining Public Health Employees' Performance, which highlighted the importance of patriotism during the COVID-19 pandemic. The article explored factors which sustain healthcare workers and identified that those who have a strong sense of national identity may have a greater sense of personal duty to act, which could in turn influence attitudes and behavioral reactions, including those connected to the COVID-19 situation. Although this study was conducted in a country other than our own, I still feel as though the components and concepts of this study are incredibly groundbreaking in this new age of medicine. It brings light to the notion that our moral compass is intertwined with patriotism, which is the why for which we care for our people. It's the foundation for what brings us together in our united country. With that said, I want to ask you, how can you care for others and live patriotically? My name is Miranda Rudnick, and I am a leader. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Megan Rydecki, the Hauenstein Center Director and the moderator for today's event. Please join me in welcoming Megan and our panelists to the stage.
It's a pleasure to be here. We have a great conversation for you, and we are just going to dive right in. I'm going to encourage you all to reference your programs for full bios of our colleagues who joined us here tonight, but very briefly, I will introduce them. To my left, from a physical position,
thank you,
is syndicated columnist and author Cal Thomas. In the center here, we have author and historian Elizabeth Cobbs. And at the far end there, we have Professor of Political Science from Yale, Stephen Smith. Please join me in welcoming them. So we are going to dive right in tonight, and we're going to start ourselves off with a very simple question. And Elizabeth, ladies first, I'm going to start with you.
Sexist.
You can go last. Quite simply, Elizabeth, do you consider yourself a patriot, and can you explain what patriotism means to you?
I do consider myself a patriot,
And of course, it does depend on definition. And I consider patriotism to be a form of love. There are many forms of love. There's love of self, love of family, love of country. All forms of love can be exploited. They can be damaged. They can be harmed. And at the same time, it's what makes us as human beings, that's what we live for, right? Is the ability to connect and to be cared for and to be comfortable in ourselves and our families, in our home as a country. So I definitely consider myself to be a patriot, and I think that patriotism is one of the most important guides we can have as citizens. How to love in a good way, how not to exploit that love, how not to damage it, how not to take it for granted, how to care in the same way that we would for someone else that we really care about, and to make sure that we do a good job of that.
Thank you. Stephen, same question.
Thank you. Let me just say first, before I get started, thanks to the Hohenstein Center and everybody involved in organizing the event. And thank you for coming to this tonight. I very much agree with what Elizabeth said, so I don't want to simply repeat what she said. But I would say to the question, am I a patriot? Yes, but yes, I am. I certainly am. But one of the arguments I've tried to make in my book on patriotism is that patriotism has always been a contested virtue because, as Elizabeth just said, patriotism is a form of love, it's a form of loyalty, but as human beings we have multiple loyalties. We have loyalties to friends, we have loyalty to family, we have loyalties to our religions, and we have loyalty to country, and these loyalties are not always, but can be in conflict with one another, what to do. And that's why I want to say yes, but, because I'm not sure that always love of country trumps all of the other loyalties that we have. Just to take one example, I teach political philosophy at Yale, and I always start my class with Plato. Plato's famous dialogue, The Apology for Socrates. Socrates is the figure we think of as the founder, in many ways, of the Western philosophical tradition. And yet the founder of that tradition was executed by the citizens of Athens for what? Impiety to the gods and corrupting the young. In other words, not being patriotic. So there's always been a tension between philosophy and philosophical mindedness and love of country. That's just to take one out of many, but I do think an important example. Maybe we can return to some of these themes later, so I do want to affirm patriotism, but always to say that patriotism has always been a contested virtue, and we have to consider that.
Cal, how about you? Are you a patriot? What does it mean to you?
Well, first I'd like to thank the Center for publishing my college graduation picture over here. It's very nice of you to do that. Very kind. Let's put some things in context. My syndicated columnist colleague, Don Fetter, recently wrote this. Increasingly, patriotism is out of fashion. According to the latest Gallup poll, only 39% are, quote, extremely proud to be an American, compared with 65% in 2004. In a 1998 Wall Street Journal survey, 70% said patriotism was very important to them. That was in 1998. Today it's 38%. Now, only 32% of Americans know the three branches of government. If you're an immigrant applying for citizenship in America, you have to know this and a whole lot of other stuff. But many Americans don't have a clue. And I think that's because of what is being taught in a lot of our schools. Patriotism to me, you do love your country. You love it even though it makes mistakes. It has made mistakes in the past. But we live in a unique nation. We are like an oasis in a desert of nations that deny women's rights, that suppress the press, that do not hold fair and free elections, that are ruled by dictators. So as a friend of mine wrote in a book once, pick a better country. I think it was Churchill who said about democracy, it's the worst system except for all the rest. And I think that's probably true. It doesn't mean that you are blind to your country's faults, because we are made up of people who are flawed. There are no perfect people. And so naturally nations will not be perfect as well. The great line in one of our founding documents, in order to found a more perfect union. I always thought that that was kind of a contradiction, because a union is either perfect or it's not. How can it be more perfect? It's like pre-boarding an airplane. Crazy. So I think you can love your country while still realizing its flaws, but we're always pursuing something higher and better. And that, I think, reflects a patriotism of a unique kind. I was trying to find something to disagree with. I mean, she said earlier we should not be so kind and nice to each other. But, you know, when I'm in the company of such erudite and educated and good-looking people, it's hard to be disagreeable.
For the record,
We'll try to be disagreeable.
we're about 13 minutes in, so just give us a little time and we'll get
I'm
there.
on the disagreeable part. You know, may I say in response to that, because I heard you say that earlier, that we tend to not realize what we're up against. You know, look at Putin, look at Xi Jinping. I mean, the United States is a country of great freedoms. It's also true that there are some countries who are doing much better than we are on some things. And that's okay too. And that's also, to me, as important to recognize. And I think we tend not to draw that comparison. So, the Scandinavian countries have much, much greater equality between men and women than we do. We're something like 21st in the world, which is not bad because there are 198 countries. So 21st, pretty awesome. But there are a lot of things we could do better. And we want to, right? Real patriots want us to do as best as we can.
So thank you all for those comments. I think a little bit of what everyone said sort of alludes to the issue of the day, which is it feels a little funny to call yourself a patriot. So let's take a quick straw poll. I'm going to ask you all to raise your hand if you would consider yourself a patriot based on some of the definitions you heard here, or simply love of country.
No.
Lovely. Now put your hands down. Raise your hand if you introduce yourself as a patriot when you meet your neighbors or people out on the street. Right, there are no hands. So certainly that implies that there is something amiss, something going on in our country right now that leads us to even talk about this tonight. So let's dive further into the discomfort that we currently feel about feeling a love for our country, but also not wanting to raise our hands about it.
Well, I think it's a lot of it has been hijacked by some people on the extreme right. You know, if you were I saw this during the Vietnam War demonstrations in Washington. You know, if you weren't entirely behind the president, then you were a communist or a commie sympathizer. And so when you hear the word patriot today as a public expression, it's generally associated in the minds of many with right-wing fundamentalism, anger, hatred, and all kinds of other negativity. So I think that's one of the reasons some people are reluctant to refer to themselves as that. And I don't think you really need to. I don't like labels because most people don't define or are unable to define the labels that are applied to them. So ask me a question, I'll give you an answer, but don't put a label on me.
Elizabeth or Stephen?
I mentioned this at lunch, but one of the things I enjoyed about writing my book on patriotism was being at an Ivy League university and defending patriotism in a book and seeing the expressions of horror, disgust, awe or something when I told people this. We do feel uncomfortable with the term. It is a term that, for various reasons, some good, some not so good, has become devalued in recent years. But there is a kind of discomfort. I'll tell a story that was very influential in helping me thinking about writing this book. I was at a 4th of July party with some friends, now maybe 5 years ago. And the hostess of the evening asked the group, maybe a dozen people, do we feel patriotic? And I felt the sense of discomfort when she asked that question. And then she asked, did any of you grow up in a home that flew the flag? She had. None of us had. And I was struck by why here we all were celebrating the 4th of July, our basic, most fundamental national holiday, and yet people were uncomfortable with talking about what it was that we were doing and why and what it meant to them. And then we read the Declaration of Independence and then tucked into our hamburgers and hot dogs and went on. But it stuck with me, and that was one of the experiences I had that informed this book that I've written, and to why we are uncomfortable with this, and to some degree why we should get over this in a certain way. I think patriotism is a term. It is problematic, yes. Every virtue, every good thing can be misused, of course. We all know that. But that's no reason to reject something because it can be misused. Democratic societies in particular require patriotism. Autocracies, tyrannies that are ruled from the top, that are ruled by fear and coercion, they don't really require patriotism in the same way, but a democratic society requires a trust among its citizens. It requires the loyalty of the citizens to their form of government, to their type of government. And we reject, if we reject patriotism, I really fear that we end up rejecting democracy in a way, because we cannot be simply a globalized society, as some people can imagine, a kind of world without borders, without nations, that has transcended the nation state in some ways. Nor can we entirely just insulate ourselves from the rest of the world. Being a patriot doesn't mean building a wall and telling everybody else, it's us against them. We have to find a way to endorse who we are, to embrace what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and yet understand that we are also part of a global world that requires us to think about others. The great Jewish sage Hillel in the 1st century, he said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" In other words, not just individually, but as a people, we have to say, if we're not for ourselves, nobody else is going to be for us. We have to. But he also added another very important proviso to that. He said, if I am only for myself, what am I? Which means that we have to think about others, care for the stranger, care for others, and we cannot just simply be. And that, to me, that tension between if I am not for myself, who am I? If I am only for myself, what am I? That tension, to me, captures the core of what I'm trying to think about when I talk about American patriotism.
I would add to all that as well that I really appreciated Cal coming to this question of what has happened with people capturing patriotism and painting it a certain way that leaves most other Americans out. But I also think that the left has contributed to this as well, because there has grown up a kind of reluctance to say good things about the United States, and a sort of sense that if we do, that somehow we're not accepting responsibility for bad things we've done. And so therefore we can kind of only almost ever focus on the bad dog element of things. And that's a terrible way to live, and it's a terrible way to be in your own country. So I think that there's a kind of a pessimism bias that has grown up that makes people feel uncomfortable with saying, well, I'm a patriot, I love America. Well, then are you a racist and a sexist and imperialist, or all kinds of things that go along with that? Of course, the answer is no, not at all. And in fact, America's greatest strength is the willingness to challenge those things that we all as humans have inherited from our past, those tendencies, the less flattering aspects of human nature. So I think that that's a responsibility that we have. I too wrote a book recently with patriotism, and the subtitle of my new book is called Feminist Patriots, 2 words you're supposed to stay away from, just to make you really uncomfortable. Feminist Patriots from Abigail Adams to Beyonce. And my editor is like, well, I don't know, if you use feminist, nobody's going to like that. And if you use patriot, oh, we can't use that either. I'm like, deal with this. These were women who cared about the country, who laid their lives down for the country, who raised America right, and they were all patriots. So don't tell me Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, who was there for the Boston Massacre, that these people weren't patriots, and all the way through the women who come up through the book. So to me, part of what my job is to recapture words that have been misrepresented, severely misrepresented, and I can either yield to these new definitions, not you. Oh, wait, I'm just supposed to disagree with you. No. Not you, Cal. No, I mean this idea that a patriot is only somebody who's willing to wear a gun and dress in red, white, and blue every day and vote for my candidate, because my candidate is the patriotic one. And I think that's grotesque. To me, that's deeply unpatriotic.
Yep. Well, I can tell you what it's not. It's what you're seeing on TV, especially the last few days, where you had this guy in Dearborn, Michigan, chanting "Death to America," where you have a lot of these demonstrations. There was one in New York today, where these young people, they carry these signs from the river to the sea. They probably don't even know the name of the river or the sea. All these signs have been manufactured. Nobody asked them where they came from. And they're shouting today that the NYPD is like the KKK, and I am Hamas. There were several people there. The rise of anti-Semitism, which is a scourge along with racism in this country. And so I would say that is, you can't have it both ways. Yes, you can love your country with its flaws and all, but you can't be, as Stephen was saying, I think eloquently as usual, you have to, democracy and love of country, patriotism are related. And if you denigrate one, you risk eliminating the other.
So let's move further into that topic. Something that was very prevalent that we all wrestled through a few years ago and continue to is how we act during things like the national anthem. And certainly there was a lot of controversy about people kneeling during the national anthem, not covering not putting your hand over your heart. Do you think it's possible to be a patriot and to exercise those kinds of actions? Yes,
but I think it's kind of silly and it's virtue signaling and it really means nothing at all. My favorite national anthem is America the Beautiful. But there's a great line in my country, 'Tis of Thee, which is the music to the English national anthem, God Save the King, or Queen before that, about preserving us in liberty and law. I love that line. There is a connection between law and liberty. What we are pursuing today, in my judgment, is not liberty so much as license. Cole Porter wrote a great song at the end of the 1930s called Anything Goes. And I'm afraid that we are on the verge of that now. You have to have a fabric that is woven together, otherwise it splits and it is not good for anything. If we don't know who we are and we don't know why we are, if that is not a definition of patriotism, then we have no idea of what we are passing on to our children and grandchildren. I'm concerned about the future of the country. In a previous book I wrote, which won't be out there, the latest one will be, since we're all plugging our books, I pointed out that the average age of great empires and superpowers is 250 years. Now, some lasted longer, like Rome, but all of them followed the same path toward destruction. Number one, massive national debt. Does anybody disagree 34 trillion is not massive national debt? Number two, uncontrolled immigration without assimilation. Very important connection. And number three, a loss of a shared moral value system. Any one of those has contributed to the decline of other great nations. We are experiencing all three at once. And I think loving your country, patriotism, requires those of us who have inherited from our parents and grandparents, who more than self their country loved, another great line from one of our great patriotic songs, we owe it to them and what they sacrificed through a Great Depression and a world war to hand down to us. We owe that which we have seen and heard to declare unto the next generations. or we will lose it.
I think that what individuals do is a matter of an individual moment. If somebody doesn't want to pledge the allegiance, if they want to take the bow or raise their fist, that person is making, in a way, a statement, a patriotic statement, even conceivably. I want my country to be different. I want my country to behave. I'm so reminded of this wonderful woman who I studied at one point, who was a leader of what were known as the Hello Girls of World War I. They were a contingent of women, including some from Michigan, who went and served in World War I under bombardment, a very important role. And when they came back, the Army told them, oh, you weren't soldiers at all, despite their dog tags, despite their uniforms, despite 2 of them dying in France. And for 60 years, they fought for veteran status. Today, we're hoping they might get a Congressional Gold Medal. But the thing is the woman who was one of their leaders in that fight, and she's like 89, and then she's 91, when finally they are recognized. And she said, my friends keep saying, why do I keep doing this? And she said, because I love my country, and I want my country to be worth loving.
Good line.
Right.
That's love of country. So if a person feels that they need to take the stand to do whatever, wear their shirt backwards, put a flag on their rear end, et cetera, as happened in the 60s, what to me defines a lack of patriotism is people stopping the federal government in its tracks, deciding you're going to defund the government because of something you've got
Yes.
something you want budget that you want done. To me, our founders believed that you had to keep the government going so that you could have conversations, so that you could have compromise, and to take the people whose livelihood depends on the fact that they're serving their country and telling them, for 3 months or a month or 2 days or whatever, you're not going to know how to pay your light bill. I think that is grotesquely unpatriotic by people who have sworn to defend the Constitution. Very different from an athlete at a sports event deciding, that they want to make a statement.
Stephen, anything to add?
Well-
Edmund Burke, an eminent conservative, once said, to love our country must be lovely. So, the question seems to be, what if it isn't? On the question of it's hard to say, kneeling is unpaid. It's an interesting gesture to kneel. I wish they wouldn't, but anyway. It was very different, I would think. I don't know if anybody in this room, I'm looking around, is old enough to remember, maybe a couple of you, in the 1968 Olympics when some of the athletes turned their back on the flag and gave the clenched fist. I would say that was unpatriotic. But kneeling, no, I don't really think that's unpatriotic. It's a statement. Since Cal brought up music, he likes Cole Porter, I do too. I'll mention, maybe this is unpatriotic to say this. My favorite national anthem is actually the French national anthem, the Marseillaise. I don't think there's any better. It's an amazing song.
Sung perfectly in Casablanca, by the way.
Okay, you've anticipated my
there you go.
reference, because one of the great patriotic moments in any cinema is the scene in Rick's Cafe in Casablanca where the German guards or the German officers are singing they're singing a German beer song. Mm-hmm. And Paul Henri leads the orchestra in playing the Marseillaise, and everybody, they all stand, and it's a great moment. Patriotic moment. I can't think of a better one where national sentiment and patriotism is mobilized in this case to make a statement against tyranny.
Well, I'll mention, you talk about films, I'll mention a great patriotic moment when on the centenary of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, Peter Jennings introduced someone he had only heard recently sing, and her name was Sandy Patty, and she had a 3-octave range, and she sang the national anthem in one of the most thrilling and goosebump producing renditions I have ever heard, with the fireworks going off, the statue all lit up. If you didn't feel warmth in your heart and a love for your country after that display, it was amazing. The tall ships in the harbor, it was an incredible day. A negative word did not seem to be heard anywhere. And that was just a lovely moment. I think we need those every now and then to refresh our hearts and refresh our spirits and refresh our admiration for what, again, the founders who sacrificed their lives and their fortunes, but not their sacred honor, as the saying goes, have bequeathed to us.
I don't know that performance. I'm going to look at it.
Yeah, look it up on YouTube.
I'm going to mention another one that's
Okay.
right up there, and that was the extraordinary performance of the national anthem by Whitney Houston at the Super Bowl.
True.
During the, I think it was during the first the Kuwait-Iraq War.
Right.
And that was, to me, that was such a moving,
Right.
extraordinary rendition.
I'll
of
see
it.
you that, and I'll raise you Ray Charles on America the Beautiful.
I think that we need to be talking about Bruce Springsteen and Born in the USA.
Yeah,
So,
okay, all right.
to bring it down. But I think this thing of, you mentioned things that lift our hearts. I think we need that, right? Courage. The word courage comes from cur, right? From heart. And I think we just do ourselves such a disservice when we are unwilling to really look at those things too, when we feel so obsessed with, focusing on our faults or whatever, that the things we get right are as important to talk about as the things we get wrong. And yet, oddly, I think we're loath to talk about the things we get right. And there are many, many things that we do. And that's very, very important to remember, historically as well as in the current day.
So you've all alluded to some things that happened in the past, whether it was singing performances or major world events. How do you think patriotism has changed over time, and why do you think that is?
Well, a lot of it has to do with what is being taught in schools. I referenced a moment ago these various polls and figures that have shown a substantial decline in patriotism, and that you have some schools now that have done away with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag because of concern that immigrant children who come from other countries, of course they love their countries too, and why should they single out America as being special? Well, if it's not, why are the families coming here in droves? So I think it has to be taught. We mentioned earlier at lunch about Oscar Hammerstein's great line in South Pacific, you've got to be taught to hate. Well, you've got to be taught to love too. It doesn't come naturally in every category. And so I think these are the things. So we study history, and history is a very important lesson. We realize the sacrifices that so many have made. The graveyards are full at Normandy and throughout Europe. My dad and his 4 brothers were all in World War II. Thankfully, they all came back, but many didn't. The Civil War, where tens of thousands were killed trying to eradicate the scourge of slavery. All of these people who were willing to give up their lives for something greater than themselves, if that doesn't inspire you to love this nation and what has been passed down to us, then I don't know what will. So it starts in the schools, it's reinforced in the homes, and should be reinforced in the media, not just on July 4th every year. Thank you.
Thank you, Preacher Thomas. I think part of it is that as modern people, we do tend to take for granted what we've got. That's natural, especially if that thing is fairly stable. That's the oddity. When people get out and say really nasty, grotesque things about the U.S. and the river to the sea, I'm thinking they have a cell phone and they bought a latte before they got there.
That's right.
And to me, that's always the thing. Oh, capitalism is terrible. Are you drinking a latte as you're writing that chapter? Because if you are, I'm pretty sure that it's being okay to you. And I think with this weird thing now about progress, A, taking it for granted, but B, it's weird. It's on the right and the left both dislike progress. Do not believe in progress. On the left, you tend to get this, in fact, at an institutional academic level will sometimes be called the myth of progress. In case that's new to you, just write that down, go look it up. The myth of progress. And so there are a lot of academics who say, well, progress is a myth. I'm like, I don't think that's how Harriet Tubman felt about it, but okay. So progress as a myth is on the left, and we are just as racist, sexist, imperialist as we ever were. In fact, it's worse because it's more hidden. Okay. Again, I don't think that you would have thought that 150 years ago. And then on the right, there's this. They just don't like progress. If you're a progressive, it's a slander. It's a put down. So I'm not saying everybody on the right or everybody on the left by no means. But as a generalization, I think we have this kind of weird attitude towards progress rather than our country. Why do we have this country? Because our founders all thought that it would be progress in human relations, and the science of government, to have a country that was for and by the people. And so our belief in progress is a good thing. And now we say, if I call myself a progressive, am I going to be criticized by so-and-so? Or, if I say, no, America's a beautiful country, am I going to be criticized by those people who believe it's all a myth? And the answer is yes. So just stand up and be criticized.
You remember General Electric's slogan for many years, progress is our most important product. What happened to that?
I think I'm going to push back a little on both of the things I've just heard. I mean, I don't think, I have heard about, I know what you mean when you say there's a leftish critique of progress, but the left has given up, mainly they've rejected liberalism, and they've become progressives. Progressivism is the dominant ideology, you might say, of the American left. They've endorsed progressivism. Now that's progress in a certain way. It means a certain thing. But it seems to me, I'm not as certain that progress is itself a bad word, at least in certain sections, in certain segments of the country. I agree with Cal's statement when we look at the great sacrifices and struggles of previous generations. How can we not be patriotic in some ways, in admiration, awe, respect for those? And yet I worry that we can't simply live off of those. I had a student a number of years ago. We're still in contact with one another. He's I would say sort of on the far right. And I remember at a colloquium we had at Yale that I had organized, I think it was just after the Trump election, I think it was on the future of conservatism, something like that. He got up and asked one of the panelists, I need something to get me up in the morning. Don't tell me about that we defeated communism, that we defeated this is another generation. This is a long time ago. I need something, he would say, to get me up in the morning. What have you done for us lately? In a way, that's what it was. And it's not a crazy thought, at all. We can't simply continue to piggyback on the sacrifices of earlier generations, because as they become further distant from us in time and now pretty much outside of most of our living memory, how do we instill that value, love of country, among students who, for the most part, haven't been called upon? I haven't been, and really in my lifetime, I haven't been called upon to make any great sacrifice for country in the way my parents' generation was. So how do we can browbeat them, but there's only so far that will go. You can't beat patriotism into somebody. When I was doing my book, I was naturally looking at a lot of books on patriotism, what were people saying about it. And many of them it's kind of an interesting genre once you go into Amazon and other things, find out. And a lot of them are written by kind of often well-meaning celebrities and other kind of famous people who want to express their love of country. And my favorite title of a book was by the martial arts hero, who I must admit I have a kind of guilty liking for, Chuck Norris, who wrote a book called Black Belt Patriotism.
All right.
It's like, we're going to beat it into them if they don't. And I loved the title, although the book was kind of absurd, frankly. But, you can't force people into this, and you can't. So I think what we need to think about, those of us today, particularly those involved in teaching somehow, is how do we engage young people in a way that doesn't just sound like this is coming from an old person who is speaking from an earlier generation and trying to make them believe what we believe. And I think I found that, frankly, to be a challenge in my own teaching and my own conversations with those of the current, 20-ish generation.
Stephen, I appreciate you bringing that up, because I was going to note we had referenced 9/11 as a really pivotal moment for many of us when we felt very strong connections to a feeling of patriotism. And we have most of our college students, and we have high school students in the audience tonight too, who were not born when that happened. And I'm struck, I was reading an op-ed the other day, and I was doing what you're not supposed to do and scanning the comments. And someone had mentioned, just wrote, what silly things for people to complain about in a time of peacetime, or what frivolity really that people choose to talk about during peacetime. And for many of us, while we have seen injustice and while we have been through financial crises, some of our young people here, and a global pandemic and other things, they've not really experienced wartime on US soil or with US involvement. And so they don't have some of those galvanizing experiences. And so to Stephen's point, where do we point them? How would you encourage them to think about what they would do to think through what patriotism means to them?
Well, Stephen was mentioning it at lunch, and he was absolutely correct that so many younger people, through no fault of their own necessarily, don't have skin in the game. For my generation growing up, I still had the draft. I enlisted so I wouldn't have to be drafted, and I was in the Army for a while. And I think whether it's Peace Corps or some other form of public service, John F. Kennedy's great line, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It requires an investment. It requires skin in the game. Again, democracy, a constitutional republic, is not the natural order of human affairs. Otherwise, there would be more of us around the world. And so I think it's not bad. I don't know if you'd want to make it a law or a requirement, but I do think that it would be good, like the Peace Corps, like the 1,000 Points of Light, and some of these other things that previous presidents have encouraged people to take a year, maybe 2 out of their lives. It used to be called junior year abroad, where you go over and party for a year or two, but to actually serve your country and your fellow men and women. Whether it be in an anti-poverty program, a soup kitchen, or whatever it might be, would give you skin in the game and a feeling that you have invested in this country. And I think that is the ultimate form of patriotism, that you love your country so much that you're willing to invest some of your life, some of your resources, some of your time in preserving what we have inherited from previous generations.
Cal, if you want to run on that platform, you've got my vote.
Well, I'm a little old for it now. That's the problem. See,
Are you?
I love you. You're so great.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm a lot older than I look. Thank you.
Well, I believe in national service too. I had a chance once to do some research in Africa, because I was writing about the research on Peace Corps. And in the country of Ghana, if you go to high school, you owe your country 1 year of national service. If you go to college, you owe 2 years, because your country and your fellow citizens raise the money to send you to high school and to college, which is free too, by the way, different issue. But I thought that was really wise. I think the problem right now is Americans are encouraged to view one another as the enemy rather than some foreign foe. So if there is a foreign foe, people tend to unite. 9/11 is an example, World War II, et cetera. There are times where you rally together for those reasons. So to the extent that we engage in hating on one another, it's quite understandable why it's hard to manufacture patriotism. But I also think that one of the best ways is foreign travel. If you actually live somewhere else, anywhere else, you won't come away saying, oh my gosh, we're all better. We're so much better than those people in every way. No, you won't. But you go, wow, I didn't know this about us. And sometimes you only can know things by contrast. I spent a year in Ireland with my children. We were there in a Fulbright. And I said at the end, separately to both of them, closed rooms. No. I mean, we just asked them at different times. And each said, I didn't know this, they said, I didn't know how tolerant we were. I didn't know how tolerant Americans are of each other and of other people, which I thought was interesting because Ireland is a kind of a jovial sort of place, but it's what they noticed. It's what they, by the way, they both live abroad now, and they both said, I didn't know how safe I could ever feel walking down the street in Tokyo or Berlin, because they don't feel as safe here. So again, you learn things about your country that you wouldn't know unless you go elsewhere.
Do you think,
Occasionally.
glad to hear that.
No.
I guess let me frame it this way. Our theme for the year here at the Hauenstein Center and throughout all our public programming has been, somebody say it, what's our theme?
Empowered citizenship.
Thank you, Brooks. Brooks in our Cook Leadership Academy, he has to say that, but thank you. It's been empowered citizenship, and the whole idea is that the world around us depends on each of us and how we show up in it. And so as we think about the individuals here and when they all leave tonight and they're thinking about what it means to be a patriot, what is the advice? How do we start changing some of these narratives? What is it that we can do?
Well, I often analogize it to, you can't get into shape physically by watching an exercise video. You got to go to the gym yourself, and you got to push against the weights and do the treadmill and walk and jog or whatever it is to keep your body in decent shape. A constitutional republic requires an investment. Certainly an investment of taking the time to study and to understand what is going on with our government. Too many people, and we're all busy, if you're younger, you have younger children, or you're taking them to violin or soccer practice or whatever. I understand that. But you got to study the issues and what they are. I wonder how many people here, let's say 40 years old and under, have ever written a member of Congress about an issue that they care about. Could I just see a show of hands? Well, not too many, about 5 or 6. Now, if the other people write all the time and phone activists and all, so if you're a member, and by the way, I wonder how many know, they're members of Congress. So many young people have no idea, much less their state senator and representative. But you've got to let your elected representative know what you think about an issue, what you think about a bill. They're all available online now. When I started out in the news business, if you wanted to read a bill, you had to call an office and they would mail you a paper copy of the bill, which by the time you got it might have had amendments to it, and you'd have to call and get the amendments. But now you can get all of this stuff online. It's very easy. So if you hear a bill, whatever it may be, spending or whatever being introduced, you can go online and read the bill, and you can let your elected representative know what you think. That's participatory democracy, but too few people do it, leaving it to the activists on both left and right. So if they are the only ones that the members hear from, they're going to, abide by whoever's got the loudest voice because their primary interest is in re-election. I happen to favor term limits. I'm a environmentalist in this sense. I think we ought to recycle trash in Congress for the same reason. But Reagan used to say the only proof of eternal life in Washington is a government program. But we allow them to do this, and we get hooked on it, and so-called benefits, and that's why the debt rises and our freedoms are increasingly or decreasingly reduced.
I would take issue with just a couple things there. One is that I think it's so easy to rag on the millennials. And in my personal experience, they're often much more active and much more informed than a lot of middle-aged or older people. I find that this generation very promising and inspiring. It's just been my personal experience. So I'd like to know how many people over the age of 40. No, I'm sorry, just not going to do that. But the other thing is that I think we do have this kind of, attitude a little bit of, well, things are in decline, kids these days, et cetera. Because actually that Gallup poll about how many people know there are 3 branches of government, those numbers have not budged from the 40s. Trust me, I used to look up this stuff for a different reason. But I mean, people have not known there are three branches of government for as long as you know. For as long as there have been three branches of government going to the 40s and 50s. So and then the other part of it too, even things like the debt, keep in mind that Alexander Hamilton knew that the only way to form a federal government was to have a large debt. That's why Jefferson was mad at him, long story. But it's true, Alexander Hamilton was a great believer in the debt as a way to unify the country and give us all a stake, all skin in the game for paying that debt back. Now, the problem is what do you do with that debt? And do you allow it to continue to increase? And what kinds of things do you spend it on? Which are all very important and patriotic issues to take up.
Well, George
But
Washington
to just have one is not
argued
bad.
against debt. If you Google debt and the Founding Fathers, you'll see that Hamilton was an exception. Most of the rest of them eschewed debt. They felt it was an albatross around the neck of the country if you couldn't pay your debts. I mean, imagine the last president of the United States to have a balanced budget when he left office was Bill Clinton. Now, you think about that. I mean, he and Gingrich worked out this welfare reform bill and did other things. And how recently that was, just 3 administrations ago, and now we have a $34 trillion debt. How does that happen in so short a time? It can't be sustained. It's just a fact. Any more than after you max out your credit cards, then you can continue to borrow and get into debt. You go bankrupt, your house would be repossessed, your car would be repossessed, you might go to jail. But with the government, spending as if there's no tomorrow. And if we keep at it, there won't be.
Well, as the punchline of the old joke goes, you're both right. Yes, I mean, it's hard to find economic wisdom from the founders. God bless them for all. They didn't know anything about a capitalist economy. It was unimaginable to them. Hamilton, perhaps unusual in the sense that he kind of saw in the future and anticipated things. But most of them just assumed an agrarian style of economy of the kind that had always existed. The idea of capitalism and everything that goes with it was just unimaginable to the 18th century, not just the framers. So I don't think we can just look at the founding generation for clues or wisdom about how we should manage an advanced capitalist society. Having said that, I'm the first to admit I know very little about economics, so I'm not giving economic advice to anybody. Cal's probably right. The debt's way too high. How far is it sustainable? Who really knows? These numbers are staggering, but what do they mean? I don't know. I just want to, since I teach political science, as a friend of mine used to say, they can make me teach it, but they can't make me love it. I have a sort of a different view of where do we go from here? And you can write your congressman. I guess there's no harm in doing that. I've never written one. I don't really.
You're the problem,
Yeah.
see?
I don't really.
Admit it.
I don't know I've met a couple over the course of my life, but except you know everybody, of course.
No, I know everybody.
I don't know. It's a different world to me. I don't know them. To me, I would start not so much by trying to restructure Washington, which is probably immovable in certain ways to begin with, but just trying to restructure our own human relations with neighbors and friends. And I guess this was said before, but I think it's worth saying. I'd like to say it again in any case, is that strike up a conversation with somebody who thinks differently than you and just listen. There was I recently, since movies and it's been music, I recently watched, I hadn't seen it for years, but I recently watched To Kill a Mockingbird again. I'd forgotten how good it was. I really haven't seen it for a long time. There's a famous line when Atticus says to his daughter the thing about, you never really know another person until you walk in their shoes. And to meet another person who thinks differently from you. We all live in our silos. I certainly live in mine. And it's difficult, but I think there are venues where you can actually engage other people. You find out sometimes. They're not as bad as you think. Sometimes they are. But it's worth trying in any case. Churchill's famous line was mentioned earlier about democracy being worse for all the others. Another one of my favorite Churchill lines on this, he says, the strongest argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Finding out what people really think. That's what happened to them, unfortunately, with the Brexit vote. They found out what people really thought, and it's not what they wanted to hear. But no, I think I prefer, whether it's in a diner or a cigar bar or wherever you hang out, to engage and find out and to try in your own way to both to understand others and also maybe to try to educate them as to what they believe. So that's sort of where I am on how we communicate these values to those around us and so on.
Okay, Churchill quote.
Okay.
I'm sorry. So Churchill, a woman says, Winston, if you are my husband, I'd kill you. And she said, Madam, if I were your husband, I'd kill myself. So I do think that I really very much agree with the idea of talking with people you disagree with and just chancing it. Saying, I really don't like so-and-so, or I don't like this policy, but what do you think? And it's hard. I think we begin in our families. That's how polarized it's become. For me, I just have to go visit my family in Arkansas, and I'm right there. And so, that's the way it is. And it's really important we all take steps to find out what we agree on. Because it's the things that we agree on that will get us through the things that we don't.
Okay, Churchill's at a dinner one night, and the woman next to him turns to him and says, Winston, you're drunk. And he said, Madam, in the morning, I'll be sober, but you're ugly. Anybody got any other Churchill?
I heard that. I thought that was a W.C. Fields line.
No, W.C. Fields
it gets worse.
Yeah, his was worse. About little children.
He said, I'm drunk, but in the morning I'll be sober. You'll be crazy for the rest of your life.
Yeah, well, that works too.
That was it, yeah. Okay, as long as we're on these, we need
to talk later about movies.
For Elizabeth's sake, on the feminist question, I remember I read once that Churchill was asked by a reporter, what did he think about the fact that they predict that by the year 2000, women will be running the planet, and he said, "Oh, they still will they?"
Yeah. So the thing is, of course, if you dig at all deeply, you don't even have to go deep into almost any of these guys from the past. It was just as benighted as you might think. Woodrow Wilson said, when I see a woman speaking in public, I always feel kind of shocked and scandalized because it was so grotesque
then he had a stroke.
To see a woman on a stage
and then
was
his wife
considered,
ran his White House.
Well, and apparently did a fairly good job. So that's the fact is that there are many unlovely things underneath, in old times, and all our heroes had clay feet, and it's okay. It's important to know about them, and it's also important to know what they did, that got us here to today. So thank goodness for Winston Churchill and the things he said, and Woodrow Wilson and the things he did in relation to race and gender. But throughout, those sorts of people got us here. So we appreciate them too.
You're not apologizing for Wilson's horrible racism, are you?
Well, I almost feel like I should because the way you're saying that to me. No, of course not. Oh. No, Wilson, oddly, Woodrow Wilson is well remembered and reviled for being a part of the movement to segregate the federal government. Right. By the way, it was the tip of the iceberg because throughout the South, Jim Crow laws had been passed, and it was sort of like, why can't we have this in Washington too? So when the South finally got its first president since the Civil War, Wilson did exactly that. It's also true that Wilson advocated women's suffrage, and the reason why we didn't get women's suffrage earlier, I'm here to tell you, because man after man got up in Congress and not one other man contradicted him and said, well, we all know what a mistake the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was that enfranchised black men. Read the congressional record. No one even contradicted that. And they added to that, and this will give black women the vote. So let's not double down our mistake. So Woodrow Wilson, who went to the US Congress and said women have served on the skirts of the battle in World War I, are we going to say that they don't have the same rights of citizenship as we do? That Woodrow Wilson helped to enfranchise black women. So it's that crazy combination in American history. You just don't get everybody good and then there are all the bad people. There's a mixture. So you have to understand it all and accept it and learn from it.
And I think,
So no, of course I wouldn't ever excuse that in any way. But it's also, we also need to say, by the way, Woodrow Wilson advocated for the vote for black women because he actually did.
And I think that is the duality of life that we've just been discussing with patriotism, right? To love our country and to know that it can be better and to know that we can all be better as well. I love that. I have exhausted my questions on this list and a few bonus Churchill quotes that we got today, which is lovely. It is now our audience's turn. Anyone have a question? If you raise your hand, we have some roving microphones. They'll come and greet you.
I actually have two questions. First, I don't quite get the distinction that seems to be running through this between patriotism as love of the U.S. government and patriotism as love of the American people, the American way of life, American citizenry. If I'm in a foreign country and I run into some people and I find out, oh, you're from the States. Well, suddenly there's a bond there, but it's not a bond that we both come under the same government. I don't know. Is there some sort of distinction there? Okay, first question. Second question is, I love my fatherland. I love my motherland. I love my father. I love my mother. But my father and my mother they're old. They're decrepit. They're demented.
I wish you wouldn't look at me while you're asking that.
They're on their way out, and it's. I love you, Mom and Dad. It's time to let go. It's time to pass on, and this has happened in human history when nations go. I mean, it's done. It's over. It really is over. And what is a patriot to do in that situation? What did the Athenians do after the defeat at Syracuse? What did the Romans do after Alaric sacked Goth? What does one do then? Does one try to keep the ship afloat?
Which I kind of like. Well, I'm not sure. That's kind of an ethereal question. I mean, I don't think America is on the way out yet, although we certainly are on the path of other great empires. But I think you have to reinvest. It's like a library book, if anybody remembers when you used to have to go to renew your library book. You'd get it for 2 or 3 weeks, and if you hadn't finished it, you could go and renew it for another however long, or you pay a fine if you brought it back after it expired. So I think you have to renew these values. You have to persuade or teach a new generation on why America is the best in the world on several levels. And if you don't do that, then you're going to lose it. I don't know how your mom and dad think about passing on, but when you said your motherland and your fatherland, are you a dual citizen?
No, it's just it's both. It's done. What if it really is over?
Well, here, I'd like to address that part of the question. I think that we are in an utterly different situation now in the last couple of 100 years from most of human history. And previously there have been large empires which governed large swaths of territory. That hasn't been the case for quite a long time now, certainly more than 100 years. And so what we have is the rise of the nation state. It's a way of governing that is new to human history, relatively new in historical terms. So I think that it's as likely that we will go away as Sweden, Lithuania, Costa Rica, Argentina, France, Italy. that's the reality of modern politics. So I don't believe the United States is an empire, or ever has been, except from brief moments in the Philippines, et cetera. The United States has had colonies, but it was a very short period in American history, and a contradiction with most American history, which is why it ended. So I think that those declensionists, I'm trying to think of a better word, but that's a word that we use, declensionist narratives. We're all in decline, we're all going to go away, pass. So I think that just ignores where the human species is. Now, as a species, I don't know, Martians come, things, all bets are off possibly. So I don't think we need to worry about that. The question is, the worry comes in of how can we keep up? I would never call my family, myself, my country the best in the world. I think that's vanity speaking, and I think it's really important to recognize what you are good at, to not sit and berate yourself or your country or your family. But I think that's the real question, is how can we become better and better? How can we learn from others? To me, that's one of our gravest faults as a country, is this attitude of, I don't need to learn from anybody else. Boy, I got it all down. Like, that's ridiculous. By the way, no one in business would think that. If you think that, you're going to be out of business in terms of your widget that you invented in 1949. You got to keep up.
I'll say a couple of things in regard to your rather pessimistic analysis of the situation. First of all, patriotism, as I understand it, as I talk about it in the book, it's not love of the people per se. I mean, there's a country of 300 million people. How can you love people you've never met before? It is loyalty to certain founding principles on which the country is based. Certain founding principles is established in our basic documents that set out our freedoms, our liberties, our responsibilities, and the like. But I just want to take up briefly, in a slightly different way, your claim that it's over, which I don't believe at all. What if? Okay, I'll give you an alternative to the what if. We are living in an unusual moment. For most of the lives of somewhat older people here, we lived, in the period of the Cold War, where the world was divided between, and the Friends of Freedom and the Soviet Union and its allies. Okay, that lasted for 60, 70 years. In 1990, essentially after communism went out of business, we lived in a very, in many ways, unique moment in history where America dominated, in the language of my colleagues in international relations. It's a unipolar world. We are the single dominant power, and we were, in different ways, calling the shots for everybody, and everybody wanted to do that. Now, you could say that, to me, that kind of fantasy, that kind of escape from history ended on the morning of 9/11. But of course, in the last generation, we've seen the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil and Indonesia, other extremely powerful, large, populous, and powerful countries. And yes, we're not the only player any longer. This leads some people to believe we're in some kind of irretrievable decline because we are no longer the single dominant power in world politics today. I don't think that, but it does mean in the future we are going to have to readjust ourselves to what kind of expectations we can have from the world. Isn't divided simply between the friends of the West and the friends of the Soviet communism. It's going to be much more fluid. It's going to be more transactional in a certain way. And I think America is going to have to find a very different way of negotiating a world in many ways of much greater complexity. It's not guaranteed that we will find a successful way of doing it, but I think it is the task of the statesmen and politicians of the next generation to be working on that issue and trying to avoid the problem of decline. It could lead to decline, but it need not, and I don't think it will.
Next question.
Yeah, thanks for being here this evening, and as well as bringing your ideas along with you. Appreciate that. Let me tell you, I'm a refugee from Latvia, which is a small country next to Russia, and my family and I decided to come here and leave Latvia because we did not want to live under the tyranny of Joe Stalin. And at the same time, we were lucky enough to give him the opportunity to come to the United States. As the years went on, when I got together with my parents and our family get-togethers, I told my parents, I am an American. I am not a Latvian American. And I hear these people that want to be French American, they want to be German American, African American, or whatever. I'm just wondering, how would you grade our attitudes on the whole spectrum of patriotism?
I'm not against, in principle, this kind of hyphenated, what we call the hyphenated American today. I mean, that goes back. There was a sociologist, I think in the 1920s, named Horace Kalin, who actually created this language. He saw America as a world of it was an immigrant world, and therefore, in his metaphor for it was an orchestra where different instruments are all contributing. It's on trite now, but it wasn't when he wrote this, all contributing to one kind of great symphony in some ways. And we're doing it because we were all different, and rather than a term we talked about earlier, I think at lunch today, or e pluribus unum, out of many one, creating the kind of vision of Americans as a melting pot, just one of a people. Kalin had a vision of a more diverse America based on different ethnicities, races that each contribute in their own way. And I think to some degree, as we have become a more multi-ethnic and multiracial society, that's inevitable, that we do have to and need to embrace those kind of hyphens. Not forget, and I think the challenge is how to balance our peoplehood, our sovereignty as a people, central to any understanding of democracy, the idea of we the people, what we share, and our sovereign capacity, with a recognition of difference or diversity as a part of that. Out of many one, yes, but without forgetting the manyness that make us up too, because plurality is, I think, very much a part of the American experience, and embracing that plurality, I think, is not a negative. Although I very much appreciate your story about. It sounds very much my grandparents came to this country, and that was very much their view. That was the view I grew up with as well, I should say. So, quite interesting.
I do think that modern identity politics, we'll call it, is at times at war with this notion of we're also American. I mean, it's sort of, yes, diversity is important, and it's obvious, by the way. It's not that we lack it. We're very diverse. As I said, when I was in Ireland, it was so strange to me to get a roster, and every name on it was Irish. I was like, what's with this whole Irish thing, this Irish theme you've got going? In the United States, I get a roster, and there's every name from every part of the planet. I'm always figuring out, is that from this part of the world or that part of the world? So we have diversity. And I think that right now, there has been such an emphasis on, let me tell you how I'm different from you. Let me tell you how I'm different from you. I'm different in this way. I'm from California. I'm female. I'm, et cetera. We could go on and on. My parents were not from Latvia. That emphasis on distinction and different, and I'm going to hold on to my difference, is problematic if it goes too far. It's sort of like in sailing. If we all run to one side of the boat's going to go like this. Run to the other side of the boat. Diversity and unity have to be in balance, and you can't simply applaud one over the other.
Next question.
Oh boy.
So I have a comment and then a question. So around 1920, the women who were opposed to suffrage were called the women patriots. I mean, they called themselves the women patriots. So for them, patriotism was about not changing and not including women as full citizens with the right to vote. And they considered themselves patriots. So there's that question about how then, if we want to keep going back to what was as a measure of patriotism, how we can continue to change as people who believe in this country. And the other part of that is like when patriotism turns into nationalism, when it is only my country, right or wrong, instead of my country, it can be wrong and I want to work to change it. So,
You're right. They were called the Woman Patriot, was the magazine, one of the leading magazines of the anti-suffrage movement. And they called all their opponents red socialists. So they sort of like, you're a socialist. That's why you want to, I don't know, have Social Security or something. Or the vote for women is a very old way of tarring your opponents and painting them in red, basically. So it's just low politics. That's low ball. So I think that, as I said before, we are a country about progress. Now, progress is always debatable. Which is the better direction to go is an important question. But we're just going to stay here and not go anywhere actually isn't really very feasible. That's when you do get decline. So I think that's a very important question. But would others like to add to that?
I couldn't agree more.
Well, staying put when there's a hurricane outside is not necessarily a bad choice. Lincoln said that if America were ever to cease to exist, it will not be because of an invading army, but it will be because of what we are doing to ourselves. Mm-hmm. And you look at the lawlessness in the streets, the failure to incarcerate dangerous criminals, letting them out on no bond because it satisfies the progressive worldview of certain DAs whose elections were largely funded by George Soros, who's no fan of America. And you look at the looting, and you look at stores now in San Francisco and other major cities that are closing because they can't afford the losses. You have security guards that have been told not to detain any looter because they're afraid of lawsuits. Department stores are closing, not just because of Amazon. You see these pictures on television. And if a nation will tolerate lawlessness, it's not going to be stable for very long. So I think, these are principles of respecting the law. I was taught to respect police officers growing up. All these other things that I was taught. I was taught inspiration followed by motivation, followed by perspiration will improve your life. Now it's flipped to envy, greed, and entitlement. You hear politicians railing against corporations and the wealthy. Well, poor people have never hired anybody, okay? I want people to become unpoor. We have spent over $11 trillion on anti-poverty programs, and we have just as many poor people as when the Great Society that was supposed to end poverty as we know it began in 1965. So I think loving your country and patriotism includes focusing on what works. What will promote the domestic tranquility, ensure justice, and what is that? Thank you, general welfare. Not welfare, but the general welfare. You can't do everybody's welfare because they're competing interests. But the general welfare, we don't focus on that anymore. So.
Although I think I would certainly disagree with you on this notion that those kinds of programs never work. The biggest dent in poverty that happened as a result of the Great Society was the increase in Social Security payments for the elderly. I mean, it was the elderly who benefited the most from the Great Society, economically speaking. That's the conclusion of almost all historians who look at it.
Now it's going to go broke in 8 years.
I'm not saying that there aren't improvements that always need to be made and things to be watched out for, but for For example, one person I'm a big fan of historically is Frances Perkins, who is the person I hope you are thanking if you've ever worked for minimum wage, if you ever got workman's comp, if you've ever taken any form of Social Security, you may thank Frances Perkins tonight. And of course was the only member of FDR's cabinet who was brought up by the House Un-American Activities Committee for doing these such un-American things as the kinds of programs that she promoted. So I think that that you have to do them right. That's always the problem. For example, national health care. There are many places where, my daughter, she lived in Tokyo, and my gosh, I'm envious of her health care. And it's just average, it's just what everybody there gets. But the problem is, always the devil's in the details. They have to be done correctly. But that doesn't mean you can't watch out for the welfare of the people without somehow corrupting, the American dream. I don't buy that at all.
I think we had a couple student questions over here, and those will probably be our last for the evening.
Yeah, I just have a short question. Do you guys think there's any hope of unifying as a country besides through tragedy, for example, 9/11 or Pearl Harbor?
Unfortunately, I think it takes tragedy like a 9/11 to bring us together. There now seems to be more things that divide us than unite us. The media have a lot of blood on their hands for doing this, by the way. They put people in these so-called debate situations who just are incredibly divisive. I remember one time I was asked to be on Good Morning America some years ago. And usually by 6 o'clock, they call you with the travel plans and everything else. So I hadn't heard from the producer, so I called her up and I said, what happened? She said, well, we've decided to go with somebody else. I said, why was that? Well, we wanted somebody edgier. So they wanted me to be on there condemning another person rather than actually pursuing a solution to a problem. So the media do that, the fundraisers do it. I asked a fundraiser once why he never sent out a positive letter on what he was doing, what they were doing with people's donations. And he said with a cold, cynical look on his face, you can't raise money on a positive. I knew a guy who had so much criticism for sending out fundraising letters of negativity. He said, okay, I'll send out a positive one. And nobody sent any money. So, and you look at the TV ads for every political season. My opponent is a no-good, rotten person who's going to undermine democracy. The other person is a big government radical who's going to take your guns and do all this other stuff. There's no civil discourse. There's no suggestion any problem can be solved. In Washington, nobody wants to solve a problem because then you lose the issue. Everybody knows what needs to be done. We're not the first generation ever to have lived and walked the planet. But they make all these promises, but they never fulfill them. When was the last major problem or even medium-sized problem that the politicians in Washington actually solved? I can't think of one offhand. So it's a dirty little game they play every 2 and 4 years to get your vote, and then they go back and do business as usual because it's all about them and their careers and perpetuating themselves in office and calling the other party members un-American or whatever. And then they all laugh about it, cash their checks, and get their free parking and discount haircuts.
Well, I think, Cal grew up and worked in the DC area.
Right.
So he's steeped in the sewer of
the cynicism.
But, what you're describing is nothing new in many ways. That's been the character of democratic politics forever. Anyone who looks at look at what they said about George Washington in his time. Look what they said about Andrew Jackson. Look what they said about Abraham Lincoln. The press, the media has always been exactly what you described. We're now just going to be more aware of it because it's on TV and the medium itself is changed. But the basic structure, the basis is not that different. So I don't want to. The kind of I don't know whether it's alarmism or the despair, this idea that it's never been worse. I don't think that's true at all. to get back to the point about does it take some kind of external jolt to the system, of a 9/11, of a December, of a Pearl Harbor or something like this, to jolt us out of this kind of bickering, this kind of intense bickering? Sadly, I mean, I suspect the answer is yes. What that will be is hard to know. I mean, we can't predict. The one thing we can predict is that we can't predict where the future will be. But I think we're living in an odd moment. I think it is a kind of transitional time between a period of intense euphoria that came at the end of the Cold War. What was the most important book, most widely discussed book written at the end of the Cold War? It was a book called The End of History, which meant that all of the conflicts of previous history had now been overcome. Fascism, communism, the world of market democracies was the future, and we were moving into a world of, and there was this intense euphoria among policymakers and academics about this world. It seemed plausible at the time. It didn't seem like a completely crazy idea, although we knew it was somehow, because nothing ever stays like that. Just the forces of human difference are too powerful. And now we're sort of like in a hangover after this period of intense drunken euphoria. And it takes a generation to kind of work that out in many ways. I think we're still working it out. But I'm not as, I don't want to be as entirely pessimistic as many of the things I've heard here about, because I do think it will take will. It will take intelligence. It will take statesmanship, a term that we don't hear much about anymore, and which is admittedly in short supply. But just because something's in short supply doesn't mean we're not going to have it again. Madison wrote in Federalist 10, he said, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. How true.
How true.
How true indeed. But to say they will not always be at the helm is not to say they will never be at the helm. So I am, it's hard to be optimistic, but I'm not congenitally pessimistic. You can look at the world as a series of disasters, look at the news, see the looting, see the disorder. I agree, I watch this, but that's the news talking. That's not the reality I know. I live part of my life, I live in New York. If I see the local news in New York, what they put on the news every night, somebody's been knocked on the head in a subway station. And yet when I go out in the subway, go out at night, this is not the reality I see around me. It's, we highlight, the famous, if it bleeds, it leads. That's what they're doing. Look at the world around you. It just doesn't seem the same as the thing that we see on television, hear on the news, listen to these media mavens talk about. So I don't know. I think we should remain skeptical of this and open-minded about what the future might be.
And I would add to that, keep in mind that the period of winning the Cold War, which is, I think, a crazy way of thinking about it, but still, the Cold War comes in, is followed by 20 years of war in the Middle East. So all of the young people in our audience tonight have grown up in America where, add up World War II, the Civil War, Vietnam, and it's been a really long period of war, which is why do we have such a debt? It's not just because we're idiots and can't add and subtract. It's because we've had an incredibly long period of war, and war is very destructive and very expensive. And the expenses continue for a long time because of the number of veterans that you have. So, it's going to take a while, but I have great confidence in your generation. So, it'll be what you guys make it.
Well, the stealth enemy of America is China, and the other enemy is AI. I don't know why people are talking so much about artificial intelligence. We've had it for years. It's called Congress.
So we are running a little short on time, but I want the last question to be asked. But then I'm going to encourage you all, when you go to the X Hall for community conversations after this, the next question is your starting conversation question. So go ahead.
Better be good.
No pressure.
So, Mr. Thomas, you talked,
Louder, please.
Mr. Thomas, you talked about how the constitutional republic requires like an investment, and I'm curious your thoughts on the line between like a peaceful protest that's like patriotic versus one that would cross the line into just virtue signaling and like self-serving.
That's a great question. Well, I was a reporter during the Vietnam War period, and I remember covering both the anti-war and the pro-first Johnson and then Nixon administration's approach to that war. If you were against the war, you were against the soldiers, and many of them were spat upon when they came back, which was terrible. And if you were for it, you were patriotic. Well, the amazing thing was that people known as liberals, or the left then, were right. The government was lying to them. The so-called body counts coming out of General William Westmoreland's group in Vietnam were lies. The Pentagon was lying to us. It was all lies. Ho Chi Minh was more of a nationalist than he was a communist. He studied at Harvard. I ought to tell you something, shouldn't I? Well, by the way, speaking of segregation, I had to throw this in. They're now having segregated graduation ceremonies at Harvard and other universities. So after fighting for civil rights and inclusion and diversity, we're now back to having graduations based on gender and race and all these other things, which is completely crazy. So I think you need to be careful about denouncing a particular individual or group of people for opposing a government policy when it could come back to haunt you as Vietnam did. It wasn't that the soldiers and the other people in the military did not serve their country well. It's that their politicians didn't. And I know people who are on the wall. I served in basic training with some of them on the wall in Washington. It took me years before I could go down there. And what a waste. 55,000 lives based on a false view of what the real challenge was. Started under Kennedy, but exploded under Johnson, and continued under Nixon up to a point. But it was a terrible thing. I mean, I believe in the Colin Powell doctrine. If you're going to go to war, you have to define the mission. You have to define what victory looks like, and you have to get out as quickly as possible. This is why Afghanistan, Vietnam, some of these things just go on forever, and it never seems to turn out the way the politicians tell us it will. It costs a lot of money, it costs lives, and it doesn't produce anything that is helpful to the... Now, George McGovern said in 1972, and I agree with this, we can't be the policeman of the world. We just can't. You can't force our way of life on other people. You can't force our love for America, but you can't force them to love America or anything about it. So anyway, I'll stop there. But that's a good starting point.
Friends,
we just want to, could I?
Go ahead, Stephen. Go ahead.
I just want to return to the point about, protests that become, the distinction as I understood it was between when is a protest patriotic and sort of when is it not. I think one important distinction is if protest movements have become, and we see this today, particularly after October 7th, they're not much more than flash mobs that are sort of organized online, and they just leaderless, that easily spin into kind of just these nihilistic expressions of rage. You think of Portland, Oregon, and places like this, or even in somewhat less dramatic ways, the things that we saw the other day in San Francisco and in New York and so on. But one difference is protest requires leaders with the moral authority to direct the protest movement towards ends of nonviolence and civic responsibility. And of course, the two great examples of that in the last century were Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who were architects of great protest movements, but who brought to them a kind of moral authority that channeled those movements into decent and there was of course always violence on the fringes, but nevertheless they were able to control the movements through their own authority. And what I see today is the absence of those kind of figures. Mandela would have been another very much in this vein, a person who was in prison for 27 years. Brought with him the strength of his own moral authority to lead his country from apartheid into an anti-apartheid future. And I think having leaders who bring to the table their own great sense of moral authority is central, and that's what I think is lacking in these movements that have just become, I would say, expressions of nihilistic rage.
I would add, I think it's okay to be unpatriotic sometimes. You know, today we're saying, oh, how can we be patriotic, or are you patriotic? And I do think patriotism is a wonderful value to have, but I also don't think we need to excommunicate somebody if they don't feel patriotic. Because it is a form of love, and love can't be forced, it has to be earned usually. And so when your country does something that upsets you, then a person may not be feeling patriotic. The question is, are they being destructive? That's different.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you for putting a beautiful bow on this conversation. Friends, let's thank our guests tonight for this conversation. I just want to thank you all for being with us this season. This is the last program of our Common Ground series. So thank you all for being here with us. And I do just want to take a quick moment to shout out the team members of the Hauenstein Center. You all come and enjoy, and it seems like a very seamless experience, hopefully, to be here. But there are a lot of hours and conversations and a lot of brain power that goes into this. So to my team, to Brent Holmes and Kaylor Sweeney and Maddie Miller and Allie Gedeke and Abby Sachs and Emma McKenna-Makala, thank you. They're all in the back of the room. Let's turn and wave and say thanks. And with that, I'll leave you with a couple reminders. You will receive a survey after this. We encourage you to fill that out. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know what we can do better for next season. We also want you to know if you enjoy this conversation and if you want to do the work of listening to people who may have other views than you, we have a mini podcast series called Reflections on Patriotism. You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts with the Hauenstein Center, where you can hear various members of this audience today and others talk about what does patriotism mean to them, and whether or not they feel they're patriots. So check that out, Reflections on Patriotism. And last but not least, we invite you to the exhibition hall for dessert, for community conversations, and additional conversation with our guests, as they all have books here for you to purchase and talk about and probably sign. So with that, we bid you good evening. Thanks again for being here.